Hi class, we're on to our last system. So we are gonna do the circulatory system. So why do we need a circulatory system? One of the main roles of our circulatory system is to transport. And so it transports your oxygen, your carbon dioxide gas, all of your macromolecules that we talked about. So the nutrients, when they're broken down, it transports waste and it transports your hormones around the body. It's also responsible for regulating your temperature and then to protect against blood loss through blood clotting in your platelets, as well as your white blood cells are going to help protect against diseases and toxic substance. Okay, so when we're looking at circulatory systems, we have seen we talked a little bit in diversity about different types of circulatory system, but a couple things that they have to have kind of in common is a specific fluid to transport the materials around the body. Sometimes they will have a network of tubes and they need a pump. In us, that's going to be our heart. So we already kind of mentioned this back when we looked at the animal kingdom back in our diversity unit, your open circulatory system. So what the open circulatory means is that you still have some sort of pump, usually in the form of a heart. You are going to have your vessels, but the vessels aren't going to be completely closed. And so that they're actually going to be open at the tissue. And so the idea is the fluid is going to flow freely over your organs and your tissues and soak them in it rather than have it diffuse between, say, like your capillaries in our system. So you have this circulatory system that isn't completely closed and that it can actually bathe the tissues. And that's what's known as your open circulatory system. When you have the blood and other fluids kind of being able to interact together, that's what's going to be your hemolymph. That's what their fluid is actually called. Some systems will have one heart, some will have more than one heart, some will only have one atria, one ventricle, and we'll go through all those as we kind of keep going. In us, we have what's known as a closed circulatory system. So the blood stays within actual vessels and it never actually bathes the tissue, and it uses diffusion or active or passive transport to move substances between them. Okay? The heart, we have what's known as a four-chambered heart. Your mammals do. That's not every single organism has that. Some, like your fish, will have your two-chambered. Frogs, you'll start to see now your three chambers. Turtle lizards are similar. Your crocodiles is fours and your bird is four. So you're actually starting to see the evolution and timeline of the four-chambered heart coming from the two-chambered heart. And what we mean by your chambers, it means the atrium and the ventricle. And so the atriums collect blood, ventricles pump the blood. And why all of a sudden you went from a 2 to a 3 to a 4, it has to do with the formation of the lungs, in that you now have oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. The four-chamber heart does a great job of separating oxygenated from deoxygenated blood. And we'll go through kind of the whole pathway. When we're looking at our four-chambered heart, oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood, you get different kind of systems that make up our circulatory system. So ours is known as a double pump, a double circulatory system, because you have one pathway here and then you have the other as well. And so what that's known as is the yellow one is the pulmonary circulation, and that means that you're pumping blood between our heart and our lungs. That's what pulmonary comes from. The one in the pink is a systemic one, and that's going to be between the heart and the rest of the body. And then the last one that we didn't really, it's kind of its own little thing. Cardiac circulation is going to be just pumping blood through the heart. When we're looking at our circulatory system, we need to look at the vessels that transport the blood and other fluids. Okay, so you might remember this from grade 10, and that's okay. You have your arteries, your veins, and your capillaries. So we're going to look at kind of the difference between them. We also are going to look at the fluid, so what makes up the blood, and then in the next note will be the heart, so our pump that actually pumps the blood through our body. Arteries. Arteries always carry blood away. I always say A is away, okay? Sometimes you'll read that it carries oxygenated blood. That's not true based on the pulmonary system. It carries oxygenated blood in the systemic system, but in the pulmonary system, it's deoxygenated blood. So a more correct way of remembering an arteries is arteries carry blood away, not a specific oxygenated versus deoxygenated, but it carries blood away from the heart. It's going to be under high pressure because it has those thicker muscle layers. So it has quite a lot of muscle layers to help kind of pump that blood. It has an outer layer, which is more of an elastic connective tissue. The middle layer, which is going to be your smooth muscle. So that means it's an involuntary contraction. And then the inner layers are going to be smooth epithelial, so there's no friction with the fluid. Okay, and so this is what we actually feel as our pulse is when the blood is being pumped through those arteries. Your veins carry blood to the heart. So if you remember, A is away, so veins is the other one. Okay, and so the vein goes to the heart. In the systemic system, it is going to be deoxygenated. In the pulmonary system, it is oxygenated. So you need to make sure you realize the difference. It's going to be under less pressure because it's thinner. If you kind of look at the picture, you can see that this is your artery because it's a thicker muscle, and then that's going to be your vein. Another distinguishing feature between the artery and veins is veins have a valve. So that's kind of a big thing, is that they have a one-way valve to prevent backflow. If you think of pumping blood from your feet to your heart through your veins, you're going against gravity. And so the body has to come up with a way that prevents blood from backflowing just and wanting to pool at your feet. And that's the part of the veins, is the vein prevents blood from being able to pool at your feet and really helps against gravity. There is a worksheet for you to go through and kind of practice where the different arteries and veins are. You have your leg, which is going to be your femoral. Your iliac is kind of higher up, closer to your pelvic. Your renal are going to be your kidneys. Subclavian are your shoulders. We're going to go over the aorta and the inferior and superior vena cava later. The jugular and carotid. Sometimes you'll see like you have the renal artery, renal vein, but when you get to the neck, you have the carotid artery and the jugular vein. So just kind of being aware that you are responsible for knowing some of these names and where they apply to. Then we talk about the capillaries. These are these really, really small vessels that connect the artery and the vein. And they pretty much reach every corner of our body. The reason they are so small is so that you can constantly have diffusion happening, or active or passive transport, depending what you need, between the circulatory system, because it's kind of like a single file line of red blood cells. So it really helps with oxygen and carbon dioxide being passed through, but also your nutrients as well that are in the plasma. They are controlled by precapillary sphincters that, if we need to divert blood to a specific region because it's under lots of physical activity or strain, it will be able to kind of have a little less blood going to one region and more to the other. And then when you kind of are done the exercise, it will go back to where you need. You do need blood pumping through everything, so you can constantly making sure you're getting the nutrients and oxygen and getting rid of all that waste. When we're looking at what's in your blood, okay? So of your blood, you have your 55%, which is your blood plasma. You have roughly 1% is going to be white blood cells and platelets, and 44% is going to be the red blood cells. And we're going to go through each of them. Blood is created from our bone marrow. So kind of deep inside the bones, that's going to be your bone marrow, where you're getting your red blood cells, your white blood cells being regenerated. Each has their own different amount of timeline that they are to cells stay alive and that they need to be regenerated. So when we're looking at your blood plasma, majority of it's water. Some of it's going to be proteins and other substances. So like your glucose, your fatty acids, your vitamins, your salts, they all have different roles. Water, it allows for it to constantly be flowing through, dissolve anything that needs to be dissolved in. It has proteins that are really good for maintaining your pH. You have your blood clotting, so helps with the platelets to make sure that you don't just bleed out and that you have the ability to clot your blood. And then you have lots of salts. Some are responsible for pH. Some of them are going to be essential in your nervous system. It just depends on which salts or ions that you're looking at. Red blood cells. They are what we kind of already talked about, in that they are specialized to transport oxygen due to that hemoglobin. They are what's called a biconcave disc with no nucleus. So you can kind of see here, there's no nucleus, same thing there. The reason they don't have the nucleus is it allows for more space for more hemoglobin proteins, so you're able to carry more oxygen together. Okay? Then we're going to look at your white blood cells. Unlike red blood cells, where you just have a red blood cells, white blood cells, you have different types of white blood cells. Okay, and they make up roughly 1% of the volume. Sometimes they are called leukocytes. That's another name for it. They do have a nucleus, but there's different categories, as I said. There's what's called granular and agranular. And if you kind of look at the picture, your granular ones have these tiny little proteins inside the cytoplasmic. The agranulars don't. Each of the different types are responsible for different reactions by our white blood cells. It's our immune response. So if you're looking, you have one that fights specifically your bacteria and other pathogen. Some of them will be producing your histamine, your allergy response. Some will be phagocytes where they actually engulf other organisms, and some of them release the antibodies that say, okay, this one's not healthy, we need to attack it. So they have different roles based on what white blood cell you're looking at. What else is found in the plasma is your platelets. So your platelets are responsible for blood clotting. Okay, so when you have a little cut, or it may be a bigger one, just as long as you're not cutting any major arteries, if you like kind of nick yourself, you're going to bleed. You're not going to bleed forever because your blood is going to clot. And so that blood clot is a protection mechanism to make sure that you don't keep bleeding. What happens is that when, say you have a paper cut or a little cut on your finger, a chemical is released that causes the platelets to want to be attracted to a specific site. So you have a chemical being released. We're not too worried about the names this year. The platelets will come in. They will rupture, release more chemicals. This thromboplastin, and then it catalyzes a reaction to produce fibrogen. That's going to be a little mesh that prevents blood from going out. And that's what your blood clot is. Blood clots, after time, will start to break down. If blood clots don't start to break down properly, this is where it can move through the body. And this is where it can become problems depending on if it gets too big and ends up getting into a larger artery. So this is why if somebody's blood is a little bit thicker or clots too much, they will have to be on blood thinners, because you don't want to not have any clots forming because you don't want to bleed out, but then you also want to make sure that the clots aren't too big and moving through your body and be able to cause a heart attack or a stroke. Okay, so we've talked about your vessels. We've talked about what's in the blood. Now we're going to look at what it's actually transporting around. So we've kind of talked about a lot in the digestive system, and we've talked about it a lot in the respiratory system. So the function of your transport. So we said how in the small intestine, it absorbs all those nutrients. So your glucose, your amino acids, we mentioned those already. It transports your gases from the lungs. And so we kind of talked about that one as well. And then it's also responsible for removing your waste. So there's lots of roles for it. The other thing in there is your hormones that we don't talk too much about this year, but that's another role as well. Another role of the circulatory system is to make sure that our body temperature, because we are endothermic, needs to be regulated. And so our body has a way to make sure that we stay warm or we don't overheat. And so the arterioles that are close to the skin can either undergo vasodilation or vasoconstriction. Your vasodilation is when the body is too hot, the blood vessels expand and cause heat to flow out. So they expand and then we lose heat. If we are cold, the blood vessels contract, keeping them away from the skin, keeping the heat in. So you go away from the skin, so you're keeping heat in. And this is you're releasing the heat. Because our body needs to stay at an ideal temperature. And then the last one is talking about our blood pressure. So if anybody's ever had their blood pressure, they're checking for a specific normal range. If you are too high or too low, then it becomes a concern. So when you're checking your blood pressure, they'll check two different things. They'll check the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure to see if it is healthy or not. There's a difference where each of them do. And so they have to look at the contraction of the arteries versus the relaxing of the arteries. And so there are many factors that are going to control your blood pressure. Genetics, some families generally can have higher blood pressure versus lower blood pressure. If you're doing lots of physical activity, if there's stress, diet, specific medication, there's lots of things that can cause high or low blood pressure. High blood pressure or hypertension can cause damage to your arteries. It's not good to have that buildup of pressure in the arteries, as well as it can lead to lots of other issues. So your heart attack, stroke, your kidney failures. So they really want to monitor that on certain patients.